so far away.
Start the recording, set up for the last half this month. I just started the recording, but I'm gonna set up for the last half this month.
Fair. You need to stop the recording.
Yeah. Is it done, or let me know, I'll call.
This should be done around 4.
Oh, okay.
I thought we were being recorded.
All right.
Yeah, that's why the owl.
There.
I'll notify you on Teams.
It looks good, yeah.
You're logged into your.
That's why the owl.
It really does.
That's what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye. Need this glass of wine.
Okay, are you guys ready to jump back in?
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked through all of the things that go into tenancy agreements and a few bonus things. We're gonna start talking now about, the actual tenancies themselves, so how they start, things that happen during them, and we'll go from there. So, I just put this up, a note for tenants when they're applying to rent a place. A landlord's not allowed to charge an application fee. And it's not something that you see very often, particularly not now. I think you used to see it a little bit more. People would try to sneak that in. But application processing fees, application fees, apparently there's a thing called like tenant acceptance fee, where it's like, congratulations, we've accepted you as a tenant. You must now pay us money that isn't to do with anything. Those aren't allowed. They're not legit charges. They're not things that a landlord is allowed under the act to charge. Yes.
They're actually really common right now because all of the towers that got built down in Vancouver near the, it's down by Hastings, near Science World, were all caught trying to charge $10,000 move-in fees to people who are renting in those buildings.
Wow. Yeah, so those aren't allowed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, things like move-in fees that are charged by a strata, those things are allowed. So if a strata charges a $200 move-in fee, that is something that could be passed along to a tenant. That's something charged by a strata to a landlord. But the landlord themselves can't just impose a fee like that. Okay, so just something to be mindful of. Okay, so how long does a tenancy last? So there are really two. I've simplified a bit and said there's two types of tenancies, fixed term or month to month. The month to month tenancy is just the most common type of periodic tenancy. So it can actually be a week to week tenancy, or, some other term where it's, every 2 months gets counted, something like that. But generally the two most common are fixed term or month to month. So we're going to talk about both of those. So month to month tenancies, just like they sound, it's an agreement to rent on a monthly basis. A tenant can leave at any time by giving at least a month's notice. But it also means that the tenant isn't guaranteed a set amount of time in the rental unit. So a month to month tenancy doesn't guarantee a tenant a year in a place, for example. It guarantees them the month that they're in it, and then subsequent months if they haven't been given notice or they have not themselves given notice. So there's some pros and cons. Pros to month tenancies, a tenant is free to move by giving a month's notice without any penalties. So if after living in a place for 1 month, a tenant decides, you know what, I don't like this place, I want to leave, they can. They can leave with a month's notice. There won't be any kind of penalty for not staying particular length. It's a really flexible option if the tenant's not sure what their plans are going to be, or they're not sure how long they need a place. A month-to-month tenancy is a really good way to go. The cons to a month-to-month tenancy are the tenant doesn't have certainty about the length of time that the tenancy is going to last. And the landlord could evict the tenant for landlord's use at any time. So what will sometimes happen is a tenant will move in on a month-to-month tenancy. And after a couple of months, the landlord decides, actually, I'm gonna sell this place. And then the purchasers decide to move in, then the tenant's gonna have to leave. So it can mean that, after a much shorter period of time than a tenant would like, they end up having to move on. Fixed term tenancies, on the other hand, it means a tenancy that's guaranteed to last a certain amount of time. So this means that both the landlord and a tenant have to live up to their obligations for that fixed period of time. It used to be, I think here's my next one. So several years ago, this is what happens at the end of a fixed term. Several years ago, the Residential Tenancy Act and the regulations were changed to prevent a landlord from enforcing a move-out clause at the end of the tenancy, except in specific situations. Those specific situations are where a landlord intends, or they intend to move in a family member at the end of the fixed term. So if that's the case, it has to be set out in the tenancy agreement and on the form, the RTV's standard form. There's a box that can be checked saying the tenant must move out, and they have to say the reason. They actually have to give the section of the act that they're relying on, and both the landlord and tenant have to initial it. So at this time, that's the only way to enforce a move-out clause in a fixed term. It used to be that a landlord and tenant could agree to a fixed term without a move-out clause, and at the end, the tenant would have to leave. But what was happening was landlords were using that as a way to get around the rent increase rules. So there'd be a 1-year fixed term. At the end of the term, they'd say, all right, tenant, well, the rent, if you want a new term, is going to be, you know, this much more than what you're paying right now. So do you want to agree to that, or do you want to get it? And then the tenant would have to choose, do I want to pay this additional rent increase I shouldn't have to pay, or do I want to move? And so what you'd see was landlords and tenants were having new lease agreements every year, and the rent increases were well beyond the allowed amount from the regulation, which has kind of hovered between 2% and 4% for about as long as it's been regulated. So they did away with that, and that's the one I mentioned earlier, didn't get grandfathered. So any of the agreements that were still sitting out there with those move-out clauses just instantly became not effective. Now, there is a loophole that exists right now that I am hoping gets closed soon, where landlords are basically able to still enforce this move-out clause by having the tenants sign a mutual agreement to end tenancy at the same time they sign their lease for the end of the fixed term. It doesn't happen often. It's a loophole I've been aware of for quite a while, but I've seen it in practice a couple times recently. I think it's something that landlords are starting to do a little bit more. So it's something to keep an eye out for. There's nothing technically that prevents that. A mutual agreement to end tenancy can't be undone. Once it's signed, and it's enforceable. So what the important thing is to know that a landlord can't enforce a move-out clause at the end of a fixed-term tenancy unless they actually, in good faith, intend to move in accordance with the specific section that they have cited on the agreement at the time of sign. So there are legitimate times when that might happen, like let's say somebody is going away on an extended vacation, or or doing some kind of sabbatical or something. They're going away for 6 months. So they rent their place for 6 months. That would be, and then they're going to move home. That would be a legitimate reason to have the move out clause, and you'd initial it, and it would be enforceable. And at the end of the tenancy, the tenant would leave. Absent something like that, they're almost never enforceable. So unless the specific section applies that would allow the landlord to move back in at the end of the fixed term, the tenancy automatically becomes a month-to-month tenancy at the end of the fixed term. So what if a tenant wants more certainty than that? So you get to the end of your fixed term, and now it's going to roll over to month. Landlords and tenants are permitted to enter into a new fixed term tenancy. So instead of rolling it month to month, they can either, in writing by agreement, extend the term for a new length of time or enter into a new tenancy agreement. If the tenant wants that extra fixed term or the certainty of another, year or 2 years or 6 months or whatever it is, the landlord doesn't have to give them that. And so what you often will see is that there will be a rent increase associated with a new fixed term. And landlords and tenants are allowed to agree to that because they're both benefiting from it. If the tenant really wants the certainty of knowing I have another year or I have another 2 years, and they're willing to pay a bit extra for that, the landlord's then benefiting by knowing that they're getting a little bit of extra rent. So that is one of those agreements that would be enforceable. It's not contrary to the act, it's done by agreement.
A rent increase above that 2%.
So sometimes what you'll see is if somebody's paying, $1,000 a month and they say, look, I really want another fixed year. The landlord might say, okay, well, you know what, it's going up by $50 a month. Where the allowable increase would only be 20. But for the tenant, it might be worthwhile because then they have the certainty, they know that for the next year, they're allowed to go in where they're staying. So it's one of those mutually beneficial things that if both agree and want to, they can do that. But a landlord can't force a tenant to sign a new fixed term tenancy at the end, and a tenant can't force a landlord to give them a new fixed term. So it's got to be by agreement. Otherwise, the default is that it becomes a month-to-month tenancy. So some pros and cons of fixed term tenancies. Pros, fixed terms give certainty to the landlord and the tenant, but the minimum length of time that the tenancy will last. Tenant can't be evicted for landlord's use during the fixed term. So that's a big one. That seems to be one of the most common methods of eviction that we're seeing right now is a 2-month notice to end tenancy for landlord's use. So a tenant can't be given that notice. So even if the property sells or the landlord's circumstances change, unless it's something really extraordinary and the landlord goes and gets a order from the TV, they can't end the fixed term. In the case of family violence, and this is what we were talking about earlier, a tenant can end a fixed term early without penalty, using exactly the procedure that we're talking about before. So that is a pro. So it means that in the case of a family violence situation, there's still an act that's not going to cause hardship through penalties for ending a tenancy early. The cons of a fixed term tenancy, of course, are if the tenant's plans change, they're stuck with the fixed term. They have to either try to assign or sublet, which is not always easy and not always granted permission for. And if they leave and they haven't found a replacement tenant, or they haven't got consent of the landlord to assign or sublet, they might be on the hook for the rent for the rest of the fixed term. And the landlord has an obligation to mitigate their losses, which means they need to do whatever they can do to try to get a new tenant in if the fixed term gets ended early. But assuming they make reasonable efforts to do that, whatever the gap is between the tenant leaving and a new tenant beginning, the tenant's responsible for that. And that can end up being 2, 3, 4 months rent in some circumstances. So something to be really mindful of.
This might be a loaded question, but what's a reasonable attempt?
A reasonable, I mean, it's not a defined term, but a reasonable attempt would be, if there was anything that needed fixing, to fix it, to take photos, to list it on some rental website, so Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, somewhere, take applications, interview tenants. It could be hiring a property manager or an agent to do showings or what have you. Basically what it means is they can't just sit there and let the clock run out. They have to actually do some things. So what's reasonable is going to depend on the situation and the landlord. If it's an individual, I think there's going to be a lot less, they're going to get cut a lot more slack if they're just a person who's renting a suite in their home and they work full-time and they have family obligations and all that stuff, they're not gonna be expected to be spending, 40 hours a week trying to make sure they get the place rented. But they're gonna be obliged to, within a week or two of the tenant leaving at a minimum, be, taking photos, making a posting, trying to get a new tenant, so. It also means that they need to keep the rent at a reasonable rate. They can't say, oh, well, I listed it for $5,000 a month when they were getting $1,000 a month before. So they can't just put it for some outrageous amount of rent, knowing that they won't get a tenant. They have to be reasonable about it.
Is there an amount that's considered outrageous? Because I know a number of cases where a landlord, when somebody has moved out, has increased the rent by $1,000 and then said that that was reasonable for the area because rents have gone up so much.
That might be reasonable for the area.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really there's no sort of designated amounts. So, if a tenancy had been going on for a couple of years and the market we've all seen has changed substantially, that might be reasonable. I more mean like if you're trying to rent a studio apartment for $5,000 a month, that's probably not going to be reasonable. But if it's kind of in line with roughly what the rents are in the area, it's probably reasonable. I mean, and I mean like give or take a couple $100, not give or take $5,000.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so at the start of tenancy deposits, so a landlord's entitled to ask for a deposit. We talked about that. They don't have to. The amount of the deposits can't be for more than half of a month's rent. So damage deposit, maximum 50% of a month's rent. Pet deposit, maximum 50% of a month's rent. We also talked briefly about condition inspections. So landlords and tenants are required to do the inspection. The consequences have to do with the deposits, either the landlord being able to retain or the tenant being able to get them back. And there are some specific rules that set out how you deal with inspections. Best practices on inspections. The RTB does actually have its own condition inspection report form. That form is really the best form to use. It has it's got little boxes for everything and it gives you some codes and explanations about how to fill it in. It also gives the ability for the tenant to write in notes about things they don't agree with. So if the landlord has checked a box and said, the carpet's in pristine condition, and the tenant doesn't agree, the tenant can write in there, they don't agree that the carpet's in pristine condition, and sign off on that. So it actually gives the ability for the tenant to disagree with something that's in it, so they're not gonna end up on the hook for something that's not actually their responsibility. Other best practices with condition inspections is to take photos or a video at the beginning and at the end. Particularly if there's some specific piece of damage that exists, taking photos of it is a really good idea. And then just making sure to save those somewhere that they're accessible later if push comes to shove. That's the type of thing that's going to help prevent, what we were talking about earlier about landlords just withholding deposits at the end. So tenants' rights during the tenancy, quiet enjoyment, and then facilities and services. So quiet enjoyment, the tenant is entitled to reasonable privacy, freedom from unreasonable disturbance, exclusive possession of the rental unit subject to the landlord's right to enter, and then use of common areas for reasonable and lawful purposes, free from significant interference. Now, you may notice a few of the words in here are somewhat limiting words. So we have reasonable privacy, not complete privacy. Freedom from unreasonable disturbance, not freedom from any disturbance. Use of common areas for reasonable and lawful purposes. That is the actual language from the Act. Free from significant interference. So what that means is privacy is not absolute. There might be some disturbances and there might be interference as long as it's not significant. So that's the best definition we have of what quiet enjoyment actually means. It's not always easy to define, and it's going to be determined by circumstances and what the situation is. So there could be a situation where a tenant rents a unit in a building that's kind of an old building, and maybe the soundproofing isn't great. There's going to be sound and noise, and that might be interfering with what they're trying to do. It may be somewhat disturbing to them, but it also might be reasonable. Because if the age and character of the building is such that it's just noise and noise travels, that's probably about as much quiet as they're going to be in town. So it's one that, this is one of the things that I see the most disputes between landlords and tenants is quiet enjoyment.
What happens with like new construction? Is it like, or if there was like unexpected noise, that's not the landlord's fault?
Yeah,
Then
so there's an element of control within this that when the analysis comes down to, is the tenant not getting their quiet enjoyment? Part of that analysis is there something that's within the landlord's control that is preventing them from having this, or is it some kind of external factor? Where you get like a two-phase apartment building, right? So apartment number one is complete, people are living in it. Tower number two over here is being built. It's making a lot of noise. At what point does it become unreasonable? And is the tenant entitled to some kind of rent abatement? It's going to depend in part on, is the landlord the developer? If the landlord's the developer, they may have more responsibility to the tenant for their quiet enjoyment. At a certain point, there's a look at bylaws and is the construction actually happening within the bounds of like whatever the municipal noise bylaws are? If so, it's probably not going to be compensable anyway. But if it's nothing that the landlord has any kind of control over, it's quite likely that it won't be compensable.
so if, let's say, in an apartment building, they're renovating.
Yeah.
Apartments within that building,
Yeah.
existing.
So if the landlord has the whole building and they are doing the renovations, then they're probably responsible for some level of compensation to the tenant if it's disturbing the tenant. That's particularly the case where maybe the apartment has a home office and the tenant's working from home or something like that. If it's an individually owned unit and another individually owned unit is being renovated, the landlord probably isn't going to have a whole lot of ability to do anything about that. And it's probably unlikely to be compensated, like compensable, unless, like if the tenant makes a complaint to the landlord then has some level of obligation to at least reach out to the owner of the other unit and say, hey, I'm getting noise complaints, can we work around this? And try to do something. So there's probably a positive obligation on the landlord to do something. It's just what level of something. And if the landlord is an individual, the level of something is going to be much lower than if it's, a landlord-owned entire building and then the landlord's hospital. The grayness of the area is what makes it challenging. Okay, so facilities and services. A landlord cannot terminate or restrict a facility or service that is essential to the tenancy. So what that means is a landlord can't decide, oh, the shower's broken. This unit now no longer has a shower or a kitchen, or they're not going to replace the stove or something that makes the unit fit for the purposes of it being a residential tenancy unit. So those are kind of the essentials of of the space itself. Those cannot be terminated or restricted. But a landlord may terminate or restrict a non-essential facility or service by giving at least 30 days written notice and then reducing rent in an amount that's equivalent to the in the building. And the landlord says, well, you now no longer have access to the gym. Well, then the question becomes, what's the value of the whole rent that's attributable to the gym? So if rent is $1,000 a month, and for that $1,000 a month, you're getting, you know, your bedroom and your bathroom and your kitchen and your parking space or whatever. And then you also have this gym facility. Well, what's the value of the gym in relation to the entire value of what you're paying for in your tenancy?
I see quite common downtown where the owner keeps the parking space. So
Yeah.
that they have their downtown parking.
Yeah, and so that might be that parking was never included. So it might not be a restriction on a facility or service, it just isn't included in rent.
But could they take it if you rented it with your vehicle, like, and you have a parking space, and they can give you 30 days notice and say, sorry, you don't have parking anymore?
Yes,
That'd be terrible,
yes, it would be.
especially if you're in a fixed,
Yeah.
if you're locked in, what do you do with the vehicle?
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate thing about, you know, these non-essential facilities. Because I wouldn't think that the RTB would consider a parking space to be an essential facility that makes a residential unit now no longer fit for its purpose. It's still fit for its purpose. It just doesn't give you the parking. And now you would have to go and find that somewhere else, but you could go find that somewhere else. Same way you could go find a gym somewhere else, but you can't go find, you know, a bathroom somewhere else.
Was there any like pause, like in how, like the termination or restriction of non-essential facility was handled, like during COVID, when people were paying rents in buildings that had gyms and you couldn't use the gym?
Yeah.
And I remember in the building I was renting in, they even didn't reopen the gym in time, like at times when they could have reopened it, but they never reduced the rents.
Yeah, and I mean, COVID was a strange time and there were a lot of very specific rules just to COVID that don't really apply anymore.
Cause I remember like when I was growing up, we lived in a building that was actually very, very close to the one I was renting in, which is kind of why I thought about it. And they were renovating the pool that was in that building.
Yeah.
So the pool wasn't usable for a time. And I remember like being told that our rent was being lowered because I wasn't gonna be able to use the pool for X number of months while they were doing this stuff to the pool. And I was like, oh, I was all disappointed because I can use the pool, but it was probably like, yes, our rent's
Yeah,
like, and it was like, okay. And then I thought, well, hey, they've said, you know, people can go back to using gyms again. Why aren't they reopening our gym?
Yeah.
I'm paying for like being able to use that.
Yeah.
Province says we're allowed to go back into the gym.
Mhm.
They just probably don't want to put the effort into whatever cleaning and sanitation and whatever is required for us to be able to have it. So they're just not reopening it. I'm like, technically, I shouldn't be paying whatever portion is deemed.
and technically you're correct. But during the period of time when there were provincial restrictions in place and orders, most of those rules went out the window. Now we're out of that now. And so now, if there's a building with a gym and there hasn't been a rent reduction and the gym is closed still, there should be a corresponding rent reduction. Right, paying rent. A tenant must pay rent in full and on time every month. The end. It is the quickest and easiest way to get evicted.
There's been times where I forgot it was the first time, whatever, no, it's the now, but you know, so. But does the landlord have to like, you said it's like a 3-strike sort of situation, right? They have to say, this is your first warning kind of thing, no, just like they can show that you've neglected to pay rent on time 3 times, and then you're out. Yeah.
Yeah, now, there are situations where, let's say a tenant has lived in a place for 5 years. And over the course of 5 years, their rent has been late almost every single month, and the landlord has never said it. In that situation, if a landlord suddenly gives a notice to tenancy for repeated late payment of rent, the tenant's probably gonna be able to say, no. You've never said anything about it, and I've paid rent late every month for 5 years. You have acquiesced to me paying rent late. And they're probably going to be successful.
You go the other way, where like, you've lived there for 5 years and you're like, I've only forgotten to pay rent on time 3 times, but it was like by a day each time or something, because that.
Sure, but if it was over the course of those 5 years, it was like once was 3 years ago and once was
Yeah.
a year and a half ago, no problem.
Okay.
But if it all happened within the last 6 months, then
Sure.
you're out. But a landlord who has acquiesced, they've accepted all of the late rent payments. At a certain point, they are allowed to change their mind. But what they have to do is give the tenant notice, hey, I've been accepting your late rent payments for all of this time. I'm telling you that from now on, you have to pay your rent on time. I'm not going to accept late rent payments anymore. That sets your clock ticking for your 3 late times, because now you've put them on notice. The landlord has said, hey tenant, I am now expecting you to live up to this rule. They can kind of reset them.
The landlord gives you an illegal rent increase notice. Can they evict you if you refuse to pay the rent increase because it's illegal?
The short answer is no. There's a however. Who gets to decide it's illegal? You're probably right. The rent increase is wrong. Maybe it hasn't been given properly. Maybe it's the wrong amount. But the proper thing to do in that situation is to go to the RTB and challenge the rent increase.
Okay, so like if that happened on a month, like I have a person who is trying to find a subletter for August right now.
Okay.
And if she is given a rent increase by her landlord for August that says you need to pay $400 more in August, and she pays the rent minus that $400 and gets an eviction notice, does she have to serve for both to dispute the eviction notice and also to dispute the rent increase?
In that particular situation, you could probably just dispute the notice.
Okay.
I mean, you can add both things. You can add both things in the same application. They're probably just going to make a decision based on the notice.
Okay, and then you wouldn't pay the new rent because you're disputing it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, now in that situation where the rent goes up by $400, yeah, because that one, I mean, that sounds pretty clearly like it's most likely an illegal rent increase. If it's a rounding error and the landlord has like maybe made an error and they've rounded up to, you know, instead of increasing $40, they've increased it by 45. I would err on the side of paying it. Because if you're wrong and their rounding error isn't an error, you're actually right, then you actually haven't paid the amount of rent that you're supposed to pay. So it's one of those where erring on the side of making the payment, getting it back as an abatement is best practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
And looking at this from the advocate lens, let's say a landlord has increased rent with inflation.
Yeah.
Based on previous inflation rents of 6 to 8% or whatever.
Yeah.
Thinking that
Yeah.
that's what the code is, because 2 was the standard rate, and that was where inflation was at.
Yeah.
Our advice would be pay the rent increase
Mhm.
and then put in a challenge for it. Okay.
Yeah, now you get 3 months notice of a rent increase. So you actually have a decent chance of that being heard before the rent increase would actually kick in. So it might only be 1 month that you need to be considering, should I pay this extra or should I not? Because there has to be 3 months notice. Okay. But generally speaking, this is the rule, period. But what if my landlord didn't do something that they said they were going to do? You still have to pay your rent in full and on time every month. The remedy is you go to the RTB and ask for an order for them to do the thing they said they'd do. Or or for an order for a rent abatement if you've lost out on a facility or service, or there's some, damage that's been done and you've been living without a floor because there was flood or something. The only way that you can pay rent that's not in full or on time is either by order of the RTB or consent of the landlord. And if it's by consent of the landlord, you better make darn sure it's in writing. So if there's been, a flood that was nobody's fault and some, let's say there's a den or an office or like some small piece of a unit that's not usable because of flood that's being fixed. A landlord might say, okay, look, I'll give you a rent abatement for this much money for the time that that's out of commission. And you might say, all right, that sounds good. And you could do it in writing, do it over email, whatever, but you need to make sure that there's an actual agreement about it. Because if it's just a suggestion and then the tenant says, oh, well, the landlord suggested that I might not have to pay for that. The suggestion is not an agreement. An agreement needs to be an agreement. So by agreement, that's why I think the rent strike is terrible.
I dealt with a situation previously where a landlord was trying to make it very difficult for the tenant to pay rent so that they could go through that process. What's the best advice for the tenant in that situation?
Yeah. And unfortunately, that does happen where there's been a breakdown and at a certain point, a landlord just wants the person out. In what way were they making it difficult?
So they weren't accepting e-transfers.
Okay,
They weren't letting them pay cash. So like the person was making attempts to pay.
Yeah.
But they weren't getting responses
right,
back to what they were doing. Communication had kind of dropped off and like the money was being sent, but it wasn't being accepted. Attempts to pay in person, they weren't around or they wouldn't show up at the time they said they're going through or whatever else, but
Yeah.
just finding ways to try and avoid that and make it so that it was 10 days later.
Right.
Before the payment got to them.
yeah, so avoidance of payment isn't non-payment. A landlord avoiding accepting a payment does not make the rent non-paid. The best things, sending e-transfers are great because it's very clear evidence that, this payment was made. The landlord chose not to accept it. Now, as long as you make sure that they have the password that they need or whatever. Payment in cash, they can't refuse to accept cash. They have to accept cash. They also have to give a receipt for rent paid in cash. One of the things that I suggest doing, I had a client who had a similar situation where their landlord was refusing to accept, turned off their automatic payments, refused to accept an e-transfer. And so what they would do is take an envelope with cash to the place that it needed to go. And they'd bring someone with them and they'd video record them and putting it on the counter and handing it to the person. Because it was at an office where it needed to be delivered. So they'd record the video of, here's what's in the envelope, here's the envelope going to you. And if they said, I'm not taking that, they'd say, well, you have to. And if they said, no, take it away, then they would take it away, but it would all be on video. So it's evidence of them attempting to pay their rent. Now, the one catch there is that where there have been attempts to pay rent, if it's not accepted, the tenant needs to make sure that that money that's for rent, that they hang on to it somewhere, because the rent's still due. A landlord saying no to it doesn't mean necessarily that a landlord won't become entitled to that money still. So it doesn't just go back in their pocket. It's still money that needs to be paid for rent, but they might need an order. And so if they get an order that the landlord agrees to accept, the rent that they've refused for the last 3 months, the tenant better still be able to pay
So that's just a caveat there.
As a further situation, there's a building close to mine, where the landlord has sent out a notice that everybody is required to pay their rent in yuan because he doesn't want to pay for the currency conversion
No.
and he lives in China.
No,
Is that,
that's not enforceable.
okay?
No, not at all.
So if he refuses to accept Canadian currency, he's not allowed to refuse to accept Canadian
Correct.
currency.
Where, I mean, I feel like I shouldn't have to say this out loud. We live in Canada and the currency in Canada is Canadian currency. That is the currency that rent is to be paid and accepted. If the parties agree to something different and they both agree, sure, they can pay it in, I don't know, crypto, whatever. Poor choice, but still, but no, I mean, the expectation is that the currency of the place where we live is the currency that rent ought to be. And I would assume that in any tenancy agreement, the amount of rent is expressed in Canadian dollars.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, this is like an after the fact thing, a new building owner took over and he wants everybody to pay in Chinese currency
too
now.
bad,
Okay.
too bad. I want $1 million. I can have that. So, we don't always get what we want. Okay. So some other tenant obligations. Tenants must maintain reasonable cleanliness and sanitary standards in the unit. Tenants are also responsible for any damage that's caused by them, their pets, or their guests. Guests means anybody that they've allowed or invited into premises. So that it can even be a situation where they invite a repair person in to fix something and then the repair person breaks something. They're responsible for that. Okay. What reasonable cleanliness and sanitary standards are not defined, which can create some friction points of that. But it's the only time I've seen this issue go to the RTB, it was clearly not kept to any kind of standard. So usually you don't see it until it reaches that point, but it's something that comes up with people who have hoarding disorders. And that's the ones, or where there's, I've seen a couple unfortunate ones where there are like many cats.
What about like co-ops and stuff like that? Like I know people that were renting downstairs to a middle-aged couple and found out that they were like dealing and doing everything.
Yeah,
And they went to the police and the police just basically said like, they have more rights than you, right?
yeah,
And they said like, if we have to come in there, because they're planning to, whatever damage we do is on you. Like you have to pay out of
Yeah.
your pocket if they come and trash house looking for drugs.
yeah, I mean, arguably that's the tenant's responsibility. If there's, a police raid that destroys a bunch of stuff, that's because of the tenants, that's
Yeah.
probably the tenant's responsibility. Unless the raid turns up nothing, in which case it's probably the landlord's responsibility. Just kind of a very strange gray area to live in. But it's one of the reasons why, there's now a specific section on marijuana in the act, because it is legal and growing a certain amount is, for personal recreational use is legal. It's why a lot of landlords have a specific no grow clause, because just because it's legal doesn't mean you're entitled to do it. So you can contract that out. So obligations of co-tenants. This is an interesting one and one that can get complicated. So where there are two or more tenants in a rental unit, each tenant is equally responsible for all the tenant's obligations. So that means that if one tenant causes damage or keeps the place in a state of poor sanitary conditions, all the tenants are responsible. It also means that if one tenant doesn't pay their portion of rent, all the tenants are responsible for that. If a landlord needs to make a claim because of something that one tenant did, they can choose which tenant to try to collect from, regardless of who was the cause of the claim. It's joint and several liability. So by entering into an agreement, everyone is equally responsible. So
I'm sorry, this is a very, I'm sure, a very obvious answer, but this is only for when they're all on the same agreement.
Yeah, so there are situations where maybe there's a 2-bedroom place and a landlord has 2 separate rental agreements with 2 separate tenants. Now, in that case, the tenants are responsible for their own leases. So that wouldn't apply, for example, to the rent or portion of that.
But number 2, it probably would.
It probably would.
Yeah.
Because the responsibility for the common space as between the tenants would remain the responsibility of both of the tenants or all of the tenants, if they're multiple. So it's something to be really mindful of, because if you see this sometimes where like friends will lease a place together. So people have known each other for a little while, and so they sign a lease together and they move in, and then they realize, having never lived together before, that this person's actually a total slob and is really bad at actually coming up with money to pay their rent on time. The more responsible of the two is gonna be on the hook for the bad behavior of the other one. And if it's a fixed term, we're responsible for it, but a fixed term. Also, it means that if one tenant is doing something, along these lines, they can both be evicted because of one of their bad behavior.
So like if my one roommate's fish tank exploded and like flooded everything and I make more money, they could choose to make me responsible because they could get money out of me and not out of that one.
Correct. And then
Yeah.
you would need to make a third-party claim against your roommate to say, you have to reimburse me, this wasn't my fault, I had to pay it, you have to pay me that. So what it would do is take the burden and put it on you to go collect.
So here's my other question.
Yeah.
So there's 4 of us that live there.
Mhm.
My friend and roommate Haley went, and when we rented it, her and I were originally living together, and then her mom and her sister were coming from Alberta, and we all 4 of us decided to get a place together. So when Haley went and signed the lease, she went and signed the lease herself and listed the 3 of us as occupants.
Yeah.
So
She's
and then
responsible
we
for
pay the rent to her, and then
Yep.
she e-transfers.
She's responsible for everything.
So is she like the landlord to us?
Yes. Yeah,
And like the landlord is also the landlord.
yeah, so you, as an occupant.
So I have 2 landlords?
Well, did you sign the
No.
agreement?
No, because I had plans that day. I think I was actually doing something with Ken.
So, she's like your landlord. So you have obligations to the landlord, in the sense of you have obligations to, not destroy the home and keep it in a reasonable standard and all of that. I assume you wouldn't. But in terms of actual responsibility, if something was to happen, like, let's say the fish tank explodes and there's fish everywhere and water and damage.
They did have one that did happen, I guess, while they were away in Egypt. And I'm always wonder if it will happen again.
Yeah, so, which is also why you often see a no fish tank clause, as a material term. And no water beds. I don't think anybody does those anymore, but that used to be a really, yeah. But, so your roommate, who's the only tenant on the list, would be responsible for whatever it was that happened. She's the only tenant. She is the only tenant, so she's the
So
only
if her
one.
mom's fish tank broke, they would only be able to go after her.
Yes. Because she's the only one who has a contractual relationship with the landlord. Yeah, the landlord doesn't have a contract with any of the rest of them, just with her.
Cause like when that happened, I was like, I am not paying for this. Like I'm 110% not paying for any of this.
And so you wouldn't have to, because you're not actually a tenant.
So I could literally leave at any point without consequence.
Correct.
So I can leave on 22nd of the month.
Sure, we could.
But
Yeah.
could not your friend who's your landlord come after you in some way if you have even you're renting and that you're.
Sure, but what you have is a roommate agreement. So maybe you break your roommate agreement by leaving early or not giving proper notice. But what are the terms of the roommate agreement? Is it in writing? Probably not.
No.
And so you just have to look at past behavior to see if you can figure out what the terms of the agreement are. But probably aren't going to be able to imply a term that makes you 1/4 responsible for everything that happens.
So what I'm hearing is never rent in your name, you want roommates. That's what I'm hearing.
Or have a written roommate agreement. Because there are good reasons to want to be the person on the lease. You have more rights that way. Because for a roommate, your roommate could also say on 1 month's notice, sorry, you're out. And they wouldn't have to have a good reason. They could just tell you to leave. So, I mean, that's the other.
I mean, like, I wouldn't do that. I just kind of wondered, like, what the, legalities of, something that, happening. I'm probably the one who's there the least.
Yeah.
And they're the ones with pets, so I'm always sort of like,
Yeah,
how much of this would I be on the hook for? Like,
yeah, well, if you're not on the lease, then.
and I always wondered about that part of the situation too. So I'm like, well, I didn't sign this. The previous apartment we rented, we
Yeah,
were both on
You were
it
co-tenants.
and we divided the rent out as we decided to divide it up.
Yeah.
And each went into the weird portal it had and paid the portions.
yeah. Yeah,
But we were
But-
both on there and both ended the tenancy and just the way you're supposed to end a tenancy.
yeah, so I mean, it's one of the it's one of the things that comes up super frequently is who's actually.
They didn't serve us the papers when we did end the tenancy, for people to come and view it properly, so we didn't correct them on that, and they're
Yeah.
like, "Well, you don't have to do that," and I guess the people who they'd hired to manage the building, I guess, had previously done that same work in Alberta, so they were just going by those processes, and we did a little education for them about, well, you are currently living in British Columbia, so.
Yes,
Rest up.
just because people are property managers does not mean they understand the laws about tenancies. That's true.
If you stick this notice just on our door, stick.
Yep.
Then if you handed it to me in my hand,
Yep, 3 days plus 24 hours.
it's not, you can't have someone come tomorrow at 4 if you just stuck this in their door jam.
Correct, unless they have your consent. So, which brings us to landlord access. Good segue. So we talked about this a bit already. Landlords are entitled to do regular inspections, including ones in London, for reasonable reasons, but they have to give proper notice in advance. So, reasons for access that are proper reasons are regular inspections, repairs, showings of the property to potential purchasers or new tenants, or where an emergency exists. Emergency means real emergency, not something that a landlord would just like to do now. So a little bit of caution on this. The tenant cannot prevent a landlord from entering the property if they've given proper notice and if they have a valid reason for entry. If the property is being sold, a tenant cannot interfere with the sale, or a landlord might have cause to evict them. A landlord doesn't have to give notice to enter common property. So if there is like a laundry room, if there are 2 suites, let's say that share a laundry room, that is common space. A landlord doesn't have to give a notice that they're going to enter that common space. We talked a little bit about if there's a yard that the landlord is at least in part responsible for, they don't have to give notice to enter that. With respect to the sale, and this is something that's coming up a lot right now. So a tenant is obliged to allow showings of a unit for sale. They're not obliged to allow showings 4 times a day, 5 days a week. It has to be reasonable and they can set parameters on it. They cannot say bad things that aren't true about the place to try to deter a purchaser. That can be cause to end a tenancy. They are allowed to be there while the showing is happening. A landlord cannot make them leave. during a show.
What if the landlord is showing the unit illegally because the tenant has a right of first refusal?
So what makes it illegal?
The tenant having the right of first refusal has the option to buy the property and has accepted it, so it would be illegal to sell it to anybody else.
Okay. I mean, then that might not be a reasonable reason for entry. You need to make sure that the contract that the tenant's relying on, saying they have right of first refusal and they're exercising it, they have to actually make sure that that contract says what I think it says.
Okay.
But also that there is good reason to believe that the tenant intends to move forward with that. So, I mean, just having a right of first refusal doesn't necessarily mean that, and saying that they intend to exercise it. If there are other things that suggest that maybe they actually aren't going to exercise it, that probably wouldn't prevent showings. Police or guests. As we saw in the standard terms, a landlord can't prevent a tenant from having guests, including overnight ones. They can't charge a guest fee for daytime or overnight visits. But a landlord can limit the number of nights a guest can stay.
Sorry, just as a special kind of accommodation.
Yes.
Read by the hour.
Charging your overnight, yeah.
Yes. I
You
mean,
need a business.
Oh, dear.
yes,
Sorry.
Under the Innkeeper Act.
yes. Yeah, so there can be limits placed on the number of nights a guest can stay. You will sometimes see this in a tenancy agreement where there's a prohibition on any one guest spending more than 14 nights in a calendar year or in a 12-month period, because that can mean that guest has sort of crossed the line over into being an occupant. And when there's occupancy, there are a whole different set of rules that can happen. They could end up having some rights that they wouldn't if they were just guest. And that's what a lot of landlords want to make sure that they're avoiding. So it also could, if a guest spends enough time in a place to become an occupant, that can also affect the tenant's rights. So if there's a clause saying, there's only one occupant permitted in this rental unit, and there can be no other occupants without the express written in advance consent of the landlord, then having somebody become an occupant without going through that step could be cause to terminate the tenancy. Similarly, if there's a clause that says the rent goes up by X dollars if there are additional occupants, and then there's an additional occupant, the tenant could be in breach of their agreement by not paying the additional rent. So it's really in a tenant's interest to make sure that they are aware of what the rules are about occupancy.
Are there services for immigrants, people or illiterate, for when you think of all these rules and all these rights and stuff, how do you explain this to someone that can't read it themselves, or, English is a second language? Are there services?
Yeah. If you call the Tenant Resource Advocacy Center, they've got translators there, and they also have a translation service that they have. And they call the service, and then a translator says on the line with you and the person who's ESL, and they translate between the two people.
Yeah, and it's mostly great, but you do need to be a little bit careful of the information, what information you're getting in there. I had a client who had called Track for some advice. She was having a problem with her landlord, and it was an issue over acceptance of rent that was being paid by subsidy from an organization. And the tenant was served with an eviction notice and was challenging it. And when she spoke to Track, and again, this is one of those information out is as good as information in, so I don't know what she said, but to hear her tell it, she explained the situation to Track, and said, you know, my hearing is however many months in the future. And she said, I've been paying this portion of rent because that's the amount that I can afford, and then the subsidy was covering the rest of it. And the advice she got from Track was stop paying any rent. And as I said, fastest way to get evicted is to stop paying the rent. And so because she didn't pay that rent for those months, eviction was a piece of cake for her. Whereas had she continued paying, now we're into a human rights. And she very well may not have been evicted. So just exercise some caution with where you get the information. Yeah.
Was that pretty recently?
Is it the story you saw in the news?
No,
Yes.
I mean, there's one, but there's a person at Track who's been telling other people that I know that they should not pay their rent, and they've gotten a couple of new lawyers on recently, and I wonder if it's one of their new lawyers telling people this.
If any lawyer is telling any tenant not to pay their rent, that lawyer should be disbarred.
Okay.
I will say that is just reckless and irresponsible and ignorant.
Yeah, that's the third time I've heard that kind of a story where somebody's been told by a Track specific person within the past year and a half not to pay their rent on something.
Yeah, I think maybe somebody thought that was a good idea. It's not, it never is. It doesn't end well for the tenant. You're not making a point, you're getting it. That's what you're setting yourself up for.
TRAC.
Yeah, no, I mean, now Track is a great organization and they do a lot of, like, they provide a lot of help and assistance. I'm just
Yeah.
putting the asterisks next to this to say exercise caution. Similarly, if you call the residential tenancy branch, they have information officers, that's what they call them, who answer the phone. And their role is to provide information about the Residential Tenancy Act. And I've lost track of how many bad pieces of advice I've heard come out of there that are just incorrect. And I've also unfortunately been in hearings where one party is saying, well, I was advised by the RTB to do blah, blah, blah. Well, they don't provide legal advice. They provide information, but some of them overstep. So just a word of caution. So sometimes you'll get clients who say, well, I called the RTB and they told me blah. Just be cautious. Make sure that you're, that's part of why I put so much information in these slides is because I want to make sure that, you have the basics of it and also know where to go find the answers, where you're going to get the right answers. Because tenancy is fragile for a lot of people. And you want to make sure, it's why I find it distressing hearing, bad advice being given by people who are supposed to be, the resource, because they're setting people up for a bad situation. So
This might be a question for the very end.
Yeah.
But I see that the Liberals have tabled a motion to make housing a human right in Canada. If housing becomes a human right, I assume that will make it impossible to evict people. Like that'll kind of change everything we're talking about here.
I don't know about that. I mean, housing being a human right doesn't mean that you have a right to a specific location. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna have a right to a specific unit that you live in. It may mean that there are obligations put on state agencies to provide more things, but I don't think it's going to eliminate the ability to evict. It might limit or restrict some of the ways, but I don't think it's going to, there's never going to be a situation, and I will say this confidently, there will never be a situation where a landlord can never evict a tenant.
Except during COVID.
Yeah, except during COVID, but even during COVID, there were emergency situations where you could still get an eviction.
Oh, really?
Yes, but I mean, they had to be very extreme. But they were granted.
If someone had created like a fire hazard in place during that period, you could have got them evicted.
Yeah, or if somebody like physically assaulted the landlord. You know, like the tenant that shoved the property manager down the stairs in my case, guy ended up in the ER. We got an eviction order real fast on that one. No, that wasn't during COVID, but there were still exceptions. So even during COVID, there were still exceptions. The other thing that happened during COVID was there were a lot of tenants who took advantage of that. And there were a lot of landlords who were individual landlords who were, you know, people who were helping to pay their mortgage by renting out a basement suite in their home, where the tenants just stopped paying rent. They were then having a hard time making their mortgage payments. And then as soon as the moratorium on evictions was lifted, the tenants just packed up in the middle of the night, left, and then the landlords could never find them and collect the money. And it wasn't because they couldn't pay, it's because they chose not to. So, I mean, there are bad actors on both sides of this equation. I don't see a scenario that will ever happen where there is a full restriction on evictions. There have to be exceptions always. Yeah. Okay, additional occupants. So, we've talked about some of this already. Landlord can limit the number of occupants in a rental unit. They can charge additional for additional occupants as long as it's set out in the agreement. Occupants are not tenants. Do not have the same rights as tenants under the RTA. You are an occupant. You would not be able to bring an application to the residential tenancy branch if your landlord did something that you didn't like.
I'd have to get Haley to do it.
Yes, you'd have to get Haley to do
I'm
it.
sure she would.
I'm sure she would too. But that would be the hoop that you need to jump through. You wouldn't be able to do it yourself because you do not have the same rights under the RTA that a tenant does. So thank you for being my example for this. So if an occupant is living in the rental unit and the tenant gives notice to end the tenancy, the occupant has no right to stay. So stay friends with Haley, make sure she's on your side, because if she decides she's out of here, then you're out of there too. So the occupant's rights to occupy the space are dependent on the tenant continuing to occupy the space. A tenant is responsible for the actions of any of the occupants they have. And then I have the slide on agreements. So landlord repairs. There are some things that landlords are required to repair and maintain throughout the tenancy. Those are most of the bigger things. So the property maintenance-y kind of things. So that's most electrical issues, most plumbing issues. Now I put most in brackets around plumbing issues because if a tenant clogs the toilet, that's not the landlord's fault. You need to just get a plunger and deal with it. So they're not responsible for that. But if it's like a sewer leaning back up, yeah, there you go.
Not called.
Exactly, it's Taco Tuesday's fault, but that does not make it the landlord's.
If I ever close my door, I'm calling you.
I will not. There we go. Okay, so. And the asterisk next to that one is as long as the damage wasn't caused by tenant negligence or misuse. So painting at regular intervals, the policy guideline number 40, which sets out the useful life of building elements, says that the useful lifespan of indoor paint is 4 years. So that means that technically, if you lived in a place for 5 years and it's never been painted, you can go get an order that requires the landlord to paint it. Smoke detector repair and maintenance, that's the landlord's responsibility. Furnace repair and maintenance. Trees and hedges. Even if the tenant is responsible for the yard, the landlord is responsible for the trees and the hedges. And fences and fixtures, so anything that's actually attached. Tenant's obligations. So in addition to maintaining reasonable cleanliness standards, tenants are responsible for replacing things like light bulbs, burnt out fuses, things that we call consumables. Tenants are responsible for ordinary yard maintenance if there's a yard that's just for their use. They're responsible for any damage caused by them or their pets. Beyond reasonable wear and tear. Reasonable wear and tear is another one of those non-defined things that gets fought about often.
How does damage work with furnished units?
So, I mean, it works the same way as with.
But
the
everything's.
But everything's included, which is where policy guideline 40 comes in handy because it's the useful life building elements. It also includes things like furniture. And so it will tell you that these types of things have a useful life of this many years. These types of things have a useful life of this many years. Now, there are exceptions to that if you can prove, like, antique furniture is a good example. Right, so the useful life of furniture might be 10 years, but if you have a 100-year-old antique that is valuable, it kind of comes out of that category of 10-year furniture, but it would be on the landlord to prove that. But yeah, otherwise it's just the same. Yeah, I had one recently where it was a furnished unit and or it was only a partially furnished unit, but the tenants lived there for 11 years and the useful lifespan of furniture is 10 years. And so the landlord made a claim for damage to the furniture and the arbitrator said, all of it has outlived its useful life, you get this much. Was the correct outcome. So it's one of those things where if you're ever helping a client who has a claim being made against them for compensation for damage at the end of a tenancy, policy guideline 40 is your friend. You want to look at that because if there's a claim for, whatever kind of damage, you might find something in policy guideline 40 that says, hey, actually, that's way outlived its useful lifespan. You don't get to claim anything for that. Flooring is a big one. Carpet. I see that one all the time. So what happens is, if there's some damage to something that has a useful lifespan of, let's say, 10 years, and it's 5 years old, even if it needs to be fully replaced, they only get the value of 50% of it because it was already halfway through its useful lifespan. They don't get all of it. And so it's a way to greatly reduce these claims that get made sometimes. That one I was mentioning with the furniture, that the landlord's claim on that one was $35,000 total. Now, they did get an order, like there was some legitimate stuff. And some of it that my client had even agreed to, but I think the order in the end was like 5,000 or 6,000, not 35,000. Which actually, when you looked at the whole situation was quite reasonable and would have been agreeable. But anyway, that's something that's a really good, like bookmark that one somewhere. Okay. Tenants are also responsible for carpet cleaning at regular intervals and at the end of the tenancy. It doesn't always go into tenancy agreements. Sometimes it does, but they are responsible for it. And that usually means professionally.
This is a half big thought. What if it's like, is it? My place, for example, was not professionally cleaned before I moved in.
Yeah.
So I took pictures and I'm like, well, if they asked me to do that, I'm like, well, you guys clearly didn't do that before I moved in. Is that?
Yeah, I mean,
Would I be victorious in that situation? Or?
maybe you might have been more victorious if you made a claim to order right after you moved in.
I see.
If they hadn't done that, yeah.
Okay.
So that one goes down to negotiations. Yeah.
When you recently moved in, could you?
I did recently move in. I've only been there for a month.
Oh, well, in that case, I would be like, hey, landlord, look, this place was supposed to be like professionally clean, level clean, and it wasn't. Would you pay a cleaner? Like, would you pay for me to get a cleaner?
See.
That would be your better. Yeah. Okay. So changes to tenancy agreements. Changes can be made as long as they are agreed to by both landlord and tenant and made in writing. The changes can't be contrary to the act. Changes to strata rules or bylaws that a tenant is required to adhere to don't have to be done by mutual agreement. They are automatic, but the landlord has to give a copy of the new rule or bylaw to the tenant. Otherwise, they don't know what they're agreeing to live up to. Yearly rent increases also don't have to be done mutually agreement by mutual agreement or in writing. They just have to be done using the proper rent increase form. And then the landlord and the tenant can agree to change the term, the length of a tenancy, or the amount of rent payable. By making those changes in writing. It's the first typo I've noticed so far. Okay, locks and keys. So a landlord has to give at least one copy of keys to the tenant. That the tenant's not. The sort of second part of that is that the tenant doesn't have to pay. If a tenant requests that the landlord rekey the locks before they move in, the landlord has to do it at their own cost. The tenant has to ask for it though. And that's assuming that the locks haven't already been rekeyed since the last tenant was there. But that is one of the requests that a tenant can make at the start of a tenancy that the landlord's obliged to pay for. If a tenant loses their keys though, the landlord can charge them for the cost of rekeying a lock and for the cost of new keys or fobs. If there are additional sets of keys or fobs, the landlord can take a deposit for those, and the deposit would need to be returned at the end of the tenancy. If the landlord changes a lock, they have to provide a tenant with a new key, and the tenant must not add or change locks without the landlord's permission. That is one of the things that ends up at the RTB somewhat regularly, is the changing of locks. It can be cause to end a tenancy if a tenant has changed locks without the landlord's consent and doesn't give the landlord a copy or refuses to change the locks back. So something to be mindful of. If the tenant wants to do that and the landlord won't agree, the tenant can make an application to the RTB for an order that they be allowed to change the locks under certain circumstances, but they need to demonstrate some good reason for it.
The woman that I had who was essentially assaulted by her landlord.
Yeah.
If she gets the locks changed and then applies for the order afterward in order to keep herself from being essentially assaulted further.
Yeah.
Would that be allowable?
Yeah, so I mean, that's one of those situations where technically, according to the black letter of the law, she can't do it. But from me, like, if she was my client, I'd tell her to do it. Because the practical outcome for her is that she is safer with her locks being different. And what's the RTB gonna do about it? You know, the actual downside for her in that situation is maybe there's an order that she has to pay for the rekeying, but her safety is more important than that. So the technical legal advice on that one is you're not permitted to change the locks. The pragmatic safety advice is you should probably change the locks and then make an application. It's doing it in the wrong order, but for a good reason. Yeah. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find an arbitrator who's actually gonna slap her on the wrist for that.
Right. I'm assuming it would be a good idea for her to get copies of the police reports and stuff to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, she should also make it. Because that is discrimination in
But with the landlord choosing a young female person that he could sexually harass.
Well, I mean, that I suppose, but the assault itself,
Oh, okay.
the assault itself is discrimination. It's like a sexual assault in the workplace is gender-based discrimination.
Ah, okay.
And it's a weird way, I'm getting a little off topic, but it's a weird way that the definition of discrimination gets met.
Mhm.
Yeah, so worth having a look at. Yeah. Okay, altering the rental unit. A tenant must not make any alterations to the rental property without the landlord's permission. If they do, they're expected to put it back to the original state at the end of the tenancy. And if they make changes that aren't allowed and they don't put it back to its original state, they might be on the hook for the cost of doing that. I had a situation where a tenant had moved out and they had decided to redecorate by spray painting the inside of the living room walls metallic silver.
Nice.
Whoa.
Yeah, you can't just paint over that. It was a lot. And so even though the useful lifespan of the paint underneath it had expired, the cost to actually fix the situation of the spray paint was quite high. And that was something that the tenant was responsible for. One other thing that I haven't actually put in here, but maybe fits nicely here, is deliberate vandalism. Even if it's something that's outlived its useful lifespan, deliberate vandalism is always gonna be compensable. So if a landlord if a tenant intentionally damages something, they're responsible for the cost of that. My favorite example of that is a tenant who decided, I don't know, she was unhappy with something at some stage, and she decided to carve the word fuck in the drywall above the couch. And so the cost to repair the drywall, even though the drywall technically had outlived its useful lifespan, she was responsible for paying the cost of patching the fuck out of the wall.
Policy guideline 40 has no relevance here.
Because of deliberate vandalism.
What about in, I don't know, for example, but situations where they paid the damage deposit, and they've done damage in excess of the damage deposit? How does that play out?
Yeah, so two ways. One, if there's an agreement where the tenant says, yeah, okay, I agree that you have a $500 damage deposit. I did $1,000 worth of damage. I will pay the other $500. So by agreement, and that's usually done on the condition inspection at the end. The other way is for the landlord to make an application to the RTB and then they get an order. So those are really your only two ways. Okay, subletting and assignment. A tenant is not permitted to sublet or assign without the landlord's consent. If they do without the consent of the landlord, they could be evicted for cause. So just a note about what these two things actually are, because they're similar, but they're different. So subletting means transferring the occupancy rights of a tenant to a subtenant exclusively. So that means that the original tenant no longer lives there. The original tenancy agreement remains in place. The tenant's still responsible for things like rent, damage, but they don't occupy the unit anymore. Somebody else is occupying the unit. So a sublet agreement has to be for a period of time that's shorter than the term of the existing tenancy agreement. So if you have a 2-year lease and you sublet the place for 6 months, that would be probably an acceptable sublet. But if you have a 1-year lease, you can't sign a sublet for someone for 2 years because you don't have rights to the property for 2 years. And the original tenant becomes the landlord to the subtenant. So this is that awkward situation where you have landlord, tenant, but who's also sub-landlord, whose subtenant is the person actually occupying. There's no contractual relationship between landlord and subtenant, and the subtenant doesn't have the same rights under the RTA that the tenant does. So if there's a repair that's needed, the subtenant would have to ask the tenant for the repairs, and the tenant would then have to ask the landlord for repairs. So you've put an intermediary in there that potentially has made it more challenging. There are good reasons for subletting. But it can be complicated. And if you're the subtenant, you have to know that there are some risks to you because you don't have all the same rights as an ordinary tenant under the Act. Assignment is different. Assignment is when a tenant permanently transfers their tenancy agreement to a different person who then takes on all the rights and responsibilities of a tenant. So under an assignment, the new tenant becomes the tenant of the landlord. The original tenant has no more responsibility for anything. If there's at least 6 months left on a fixed term lease, the landlord can't unreasonably withhold consent to assign. They can reasonably withhold consent. So if they have a good reason, they can withhold consent. And if there's less than 6 months left, they can withhold consent without any reason, good or otherwise. So roommates. Roommates are occupants, they are not tenants. They do not have the rights of tenants. If a tenant decides their tenancy is over, a roommate has no right to continue unless the landlord agrees to make them a tenant, but a landlord is not obliged to enter into an agreement with a roommate. Tenants are responsible for the actions of their roommates, including damage. A roommate agreement can be ended at any time with or without cause, unless there's a written agreement that says otherwise. And the Civil Resolution Tribunal who has jurisdiction over a number of things, including small claims, 5,000 and less. They have issued decisions that say an appropriate amount of time to give notice to end a roommate agreement is a month. So when you've got clients coming to you who are, have landlord complaints, you need to make sure that they're a tenant, they're not a roommate or an occupant. Actually, they won't have the same rights. So what about spouses and children? They don't necessarily have the same tenancy rights. And that's, it's one that comes up not infrequently, where one person signs a lease and then their spouse moves in and the spouse isn't a tenant. The landlord may, if the tenancy agreement requires consent for additional occupants and the spouse moves in without consent, it might be cause to end the tenancy. Similarly, in my earlier example about the couple who had a baby and then suddenly had to pay a bunch more rent, that's not expressly prohibited under the Act. And so those are some of the areas I'm expecting changes over the next few years, but I've been sort of expecting those changes for a while, so who knows? So it's just, it's one of those, I specifically made the picture gray because it is a gray area. It's not certain. There are human rights considerations with, to use the example of a spouse or a child living in the place that previously was occupied by one person. There might be a discrimination based on family status argument there if the tenant is evicted for that. But there also may be a good reason why that restriction is put in place. Maybe the place is really tiny and only suitable for one person. So it may be a successful claim, but it's going to be a large hoop to jump through for a tenant who's being evicted. So best practices on that one is to keep the landlord informed. So if a child or a spouse is going to move into a place, it's best to tell the landlord and make sure that you're actually papering it properly if you can. Okay. Wait, rent increases. So talked about this a little bit. Right now, the allowable rent increase is 2% of the rent. Next year, who knows what it's going to be. There was no rent increase during the COVID period, so there's been this long period of no rent increases. I'm expecting that next year's will be higher, but we won't know until September. So in order to increase rent in this ordinary circumstance of this sort of annual rent increase, a landlord, there's a very specific form that's available on the RTD's website. The landlord has to use that very specific form and they have to get the calculations right. Can't round up. It needs to be either rounded down or right to the penny. In order to increase the rent, it's got to be served on the tenant at least 3 months in advance. That means that if on July 31st, a landlord posts a notice of rent increase on the tenant's door, it's not going to be effective until 4 months because it takes 3 days for the service to be effective because it's posted on the door, not handed to the person. So it's the effect of that doesn't mean that the rent increase is invalid. It just means it happens 4 months later instead of 3 months later. It's still valid, just it's valid later. Other ways that rent can increase, a landlord can and a tenant can agree to a rent increase. So if they do, they have to agree in writing. They have to agree what the amount is, and they have to agree when that increase is going to be payable. It can go with or without a new fixed term. What sometimes will happen is a landlord will say, hey, look, tenant, I know that this is what the allowable rent increase is, but my property taxes went up threefold and I'm really struggling and I'd like you to stay, but I might have to sell the place if I'm still losing money on it. Would you agree to a little bit extra rent increase? That's the kind of scenario where there are agreed rent increases fairly frequently. Sometimes it's a little bit more pressure tactic-y than that. But if it's done by agreement and it's done in writing and it's done sort of in accordance with the Act, it is enforceable. There's a policy guideline on all the different types of rent increases, so if you ever have a client who's dealing with that, go check, there are 4 different policy guidelines on it. The other way a rent increase can happen is if the landlord applies to the residential tenancy branch for an order that they be allowed to increase the rent. And they can do that on 2 bases. One is capital expenditures, so like big, huge improvements that, you know, or necessary repairs that are super costly. The other one can be significant expenditures, but only in certain circumstances. So it has to be something unforeseeable. It can't be like, I got a variable mortgage and now my mortgage costs me a lot more money and I need more money from the tenant. That's not going to be the kind of circumstance that would allow them to increase it. But if, for example, their property was zoned, like the zoning changed and their property taxes are now being taxed at a rate that was, you know, that's wildly different from what they were expecting, that might be an allowable one where the RTB would say, yeah, okay, I'm going to allow a rent increase in an amount of whatever. So a word about forms. The RTB loves its forms. The RTB has a lot of forms. They're all available on their website. They're mostly reasonably easy to find, but not all of them. There's a section that says forms, but then there's another one that says like list forms alphabetically or something. And miraculously, it has more forms than the other forms did. Thank you, RTB, and your incomprehensible pages. So there are some forms that the RTB has that are for convenience, and there are some forms that the RTB has that are mandatory to use to do certain things. The ones that are for convenience tend to be the ones that a landlord or a tenant can use. The ones that are mandatory tend to be ones that landlords are required to use in order to do certain things. So if a landlord wants to give a notice to end tenancy, they must use the proper form from the RTB's website, the most up-to-date version, and they have to serve all the pages. So for example, the 2-month notice to end tenancy form currently, in its current iteration, has 4 pages. 2 pages where you fill things in, 2 pages of information. If you only serve the 2 pages where you fill stuff in, but not the 2 information pages, the notice is not valid. So if a client comes to you and they've got a notice to end tenancy and it at the bottom says page 1 of 4, 2 of 4, and then there's no 3 of 4 and 4 of 4, that notice probably isn't valid. So that's one of those places where the RTB really loves its forms. Now, you're not required to use the RTB's tenancy or the tenancy agreement. So the residential tenancy agreement in that format isn't mandatory. Would almost be easier if it was, but it's, yeah.
You would think that the actual tenancy agreement would be standardized,
Wouldn't
because
Right?
it could prevent so many problems. Do you have any insights into why it's never been updated?
No.
Didn't you just say that the one that they have out, their agreement is like, a lot of the wording isn't necessarily in alignment with the act as well?
Like
Or
it's
some of it?
It's more or less in alignment, but the wording itself isn't the exact wording. And what I find ironic about that is that the exact wording is what's required. And that's not what's in their own form. It's a little bit funny. But yeah, it's a standard form and a lot of people use it. A lot of organizations use it. If I'm putting together a tenancy agreement for a client, I use that form as the basis because it's the easiest, it's the cleanest. It's also the one that arbitrators understand and will know how to interpret better than one that's been drafted just, you know, by a property manager, for example. But it's not mandatory. So some of the, so a notice of rent increase, mandatory form. Notice to end tenancy, mandatory form. A tenant's notice that they're going to end the tenancy, not mandatory. They can do it in a different way. There are certain types of mutual agreements that don't have to be on RTB's forms. One that does have to be on RTB's form is a mutual agreement to end tenancy if you want to make sure it's enforceable. You can agree to end a tenancy mutually without using that form. That might be hard to do. So it's just, sort of a word of caution. If you have a client who has been given something that doesn't look like an RTB form, telling them they have to do something, you should go see if there's a form that actually deals with the thing they're being told to do. If you have a client who wants to do something or give some notice to a landlord, you should go see if there's a form that does that. And if there is, you should use it. It's the best way to make sure it's done right. And all the pages are always important. So there's my words about forms. So service of notices. There are a bunch of different ways that you can serve most documents. Some documents have to be served in certain ways. So if you have to serve a document, you need to know what way you're allowed to serve the document. Email service, unless there's an actual agreement on the tenancy, the tenancy agreement itself that says somebody will accept service by email at a specific email address, or you have some other agreement that says I agree to receive notices by email, then email service is not sufficient service. It's really counterintuitive because it is how most people communicate, either by email or text. Text is never acceptable service. Email is sometimes acceptable service. But the RTB, because it still lives in the Stone Ages, prefers that everything be sent by registered mail. Yes, registered mail. There are rules about when something is deemed to have been delivered. So if service by email is acceptable, you send the email, is deemed to have been delivered 3 days later. Unless the person responds right away, in which case you have proof of when they received it. If you post something on somebody's door, which literally means sticking it to the door, it's deemed received 3 days later. Same for mailbox, mail slot. If you hand it right to the person, then it's delivered. If you send it by regular mail, it is deemed delivered 5 days later. If you send it by registered mail, it is deemed delivered 5 days later. Unless the tracking says otherwise. But if you send it and somebody fails to go pick up their registered mail, it's still deemed to be served 5 days later, even if they never pick it up. So there are situations that can happen where somebody's deemed to have been served with something important because it got sent by registered mail, but they never got it. They've never seen it. They don't even know about it. And I've seen this happen with landlords getting orders of possession that a tenant never knew there was a hearing happening. I've seen it with notices to end tenancy that a tenant never saw. I've seen it where tenants make big claims against landlords and the landlord never gets the notice. And so they don't participate, and then there's a monetary order. So it's best practice if you're ever helping a client with serving something to send it the way it has to be sent. You know, if the particular document needs to be sent by mail, registered or otherwise, send it by registered mail, but also email it. Send it in all the different ways that somebody might actually be able to get it. Send them a text message and say, hey, make sure you pick up your registered mail. That's going to reduce your chances of having a hearing go sideways because somebody said they weren't served properly. Yeah.
What if Canada Post admits to losing your registered mail?
I've had that happen.
That they admitted to it?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I've had it happen twice. And in that case, it's not properly served. Even though you did it under the deemed service provisions. I had an arbitrator once try to say that it was still properly served. And my answer to them was, how can it be properly served when you actually have proof that there was never an attempted delivery? And so this person never had the opportunity to see what was in the envelope. And I obviously won that argument because to deem that something is served that a person never had a chance of seeing is not good. But what can sometimes happen if the service provisions are like adhered to, but the person didn't actually get the thing they were supposed to get, you can have your hearings derailed, and then they get rescheduled like months down the road. And depending on what the application's for, that can be really problematic. So it's always best to try to make sure that things get served the way they need to.
Could you do like an email and then say in the email that a hard copy will be?
Mhm.
That kind of your best
Yeah.
bet?
Yeah, I usually, if I'm serving something, I'll usually send it by registered mail, and then I'll send an email and say, I'm attaching this copy as a courtesy. I have also sent it by registered mail. Please be sure you check your mail. And then if they know it's coming and then they refuse to go pick it up, I know that I sent it to them twice. And I'm able to upload that email as evidence showing that, hey, look, not only do I have all the tracking information, I also have this email where I sent it to you. Yeah.
I noticed that the Residential Tenancy Act notes that when serving something over email, you're allowed to serve email if it's been agreed upon by both the landlord and the tenant
Yeah.
that you're allowed to use email to serve documents. But is there does it have to be like explicit agreement, or if two people have been using email up until that point, does it apply?
It actually has to be explicit.
Okay.
They won't imply.
Okay.
Yeah, even where it's obvious that that's how they communicate, it has to be explicit. So you can, like, the other way you can do that is to say, here attached is whatever. Do you agree to accept this by email? Or would you like me to also send this by registered mail? If they respond right away and say, I agree to accept this by email, terrific. If they don't respond, then just send it by registered mail anyway. But if you can save that step, it's usually best. Most people would prefer to get things on email. Okay, so when things go wrong, just, why we're all here, things go wrong in tenancies. Okay, so emergency repairs. When there's an emergency in a rental unit, a tenant has to make 2 attempts to contact a landlord or their agent, and tell them about the emergency and ask for the repairs. So if there is a flood, they need to make a phone call, and then if that phone call doesn't go through, they need to make another phone call. Now, the act is silent on whether those calls can be back-to-back or whether they need to leave some kind of gap in between, but they have to have tried at least twice. If a tenant has tried twice, and they haven't managed to reach a landlord, they can undertake the repairs themselves and deduct that from rent. Now, getting an order to do that is your best practice, for sure. But they are allowed to ask for that reimbursement. If a tenant undertakes a repair and it's not an emergency repair, they don't have the right to ask for the reimbursement. So if there's something that's not an emergency, but it's just bothering the tenant, they're like, you know what? Like the sink is leaking, I'm just gonna call a plumber. And they call a plumber and then they say, hey landlord, here's, $150 for the plumber. The landlord can say, no, not anything about that. You didn't give me a chance to do anything about it. I'm not gonna pay for that. And an arbitrator's gonna uphold that. They're gonna say, no, the landlord doesn't need to pay for that because it wasn't an emergency. You didn't make 2 attempts to contact them anyway, and they don't have to pay for that. But emergency repairs are different. So emergency repairs are things that are limited to things urgent and necessary for health and safety of people or property. So there are actually limits, and these are the limits. So major leaks in pipes or roofs. So that doesn't mean like small leaks or drips. That means like massive amounts of water. Damaged or blocked water or sewer pipes or plumbing fixtures. Again, with the caveat that if you need to just go get a plumber or a plunger, that's on you. Primary heating system. So in the winter, if the heat goes out, that's an emergency. Damaged or defective locks that affect entry. So if something has happened to your lock and you actually can't enter your place, that's an emergency. And electrical systems. And electrical can mean almost anything electrical. If there's an outlet that sparks, that's an emergency. That one doesn't have to be like an electrical But anything electrical is considered to be a significant enough risk to safety that it's included in emergency repairs. So if yes, I already said that last part. Okay. So responsibility for damage or loss. Sickening dog got it. So if a tenant causes a flood or a fire or some other significant damages, they are responsible for the losses caused by that damage. If a flood or a fire isn't their fault, they're not responsible for the damage, unless they know about the issue and they don't tell the landlord. So if a tenant knows, either because they can see it or they're alerted to it, that there's a significant flood, and they don't make any attempts to tell the landlord, which means the landlord can't try to do anything to mitigate whatever the loss is, they might be responsible for that. A landlord isn't responsible for damage to a tenant's belongings unless the landlord caused the flood or the fire or the issue that caused the damage. A landlord is not responsible for finding the tenant alternative accommodations if they can't live in a rental unit that's been destroyed or needs major repairs. They may be required to waive rent if the place is unlivable, but they are not obliged to go find the tenant another place to stay.
I'm assuming unless there's a tenant relocation plan in existence for it.
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions that exist, but in an ordinary tenancy, this is not the responsibility of the landlord. It's one of the things that would often be covered by tenant insurance, but it's never covered by landlord insurance. I have never seen a policy that covers it, and it's not the landlord's obligation. If the place is not livable, the tenant is not usually going to be obliged to pay for the place that they can't live in. So that's sort of the exception there, but it's not in the landlord.
So one of our communities up north, has quite a few people who are renters, and they've lived or leased those properties for years and years and years. And it's more, damage or loss due to neglect of the property. So you have people who, the house was built in the 60s and it's never had one bit of work done. And then the medical officer of health comes in and says, this house is, not habitable. So what would happen in that situation? Would that be considered,
So that's probably a frustrated tenancy, which is, well, we already talked about insurance, so there we go.
Oh,
Frustrated tenancies. So it's probably a frustrated tenancy, which the RTB policy guideline explains, is a contract is frustrated where without the fault of either party. Now, we can talk about fault in the situation that you're just describing, but where a contract becomes incapable of being performed because some unforeseeable event has so radically changed the circumstances that fulfillment of the contract as originally intended is impossible. So at that point, the contract is treated as at an end, effective immediately. So in this situation, the unforeseeable event might be an order that the place is not habitable. Now, is it totally unforeseeable? Maybe not, because there are some repairs that need to be done that haven't been done. But, you know, on that day, probably nobody woke up expecting that there was going to be, you know, a non-occupancy order for. Now you get into a situation of like, should that have, like, did it happen because of the fault of the landlord for failing to do the repairs? Maybe, you know, but it's still probably going to be a frustrating one.
what if there is no tenancy agreement? When someone was just historically lived in the house for 20 years, and then one day the roof collapses. Or there's the medical officer of health comes in, and deems that there's too much mold and the house is not habitable.
Yeah.
Would the RTA apply in that situation, since there's never a tenancy to agree with, in the first place.
But there is a tenancy agreement because it's implied, has all the standard terms.
So even if they never signed an agreement.
Mhm.
And this is, okay, this is a specific situation I can think of, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so there is a tenancy agreement and the tenancy agreement contains the standard terms.
And it would be deemed to be a month to month, so the tenant would just have to give 1 month's notice. Or
Except if the roof has just collapsed, that place is instantly not habitable, which means the tenancy is frustrated and they can treat it as an end immediately.
is
If
there
it
any
happened
paperwork?
on,
Is there any paperwork that has to be
I mean,
filled out?
I mean, there can be an agreement that a tenancy is frustrated and everybody can agree to walk away. If the roof collapsed on the 15th of the month and rent had been paid for the month, the tenant would be entitled to return half of the month's rent because they can't live in this place for half the month because it has no roof now. The question of damage to belongings becomes a little bit more complicated in that situation because if it's, if it was an earthquake and it took the building down, that's nobody's fault. Nobody's going to be responsible for that. Everyone sort of is responsible for their own stuff. If it was negligence on behalf of the landlord for failing to properly maintain that caused the loss, then the tenant can go to the RTB and make a claim for the cost of repairing the damage or replacing their items or whatever the loss is. And that one would probably be sustainable because in a situation like that, I wouldn't think negligence would be super hard to show.
Would the RTA still apply if the tenant had a land lease that was registered to title?
Oh.
And we have a community that's very much like that, where
Okay.
a lot of the people that live in the housing, it's kind of like, wondering, where they think they own the house, but if you actually look on title, they have like a 60-year land lease, and they are technically a tenant because they're not on title.
Right.
They have a long-term lease that gives them right to occupy that building in that land.
Yeah, who owns the building?
The estate of a relative, typically in this community. Someone who is not around anymore and their estate has never been resolved.
Okay, so there are rules about leases that last longer than 25 years. And so it might be captured under that. But I think I need to know what the details of the actual specifics of the lease. To see what it says about, and maybe there's nothing in writing. But that gets much more complicated if you're talking about something that's registered on title. Because as soon as there's something that's registered on title, it's an interest in land. And so, like, if I was to rent a house, a standalone single family house, I wouldn't have an interest in the land because it's still just a lease for a residential tenancy. But where you have a lease that's actually registered on title of the property, it's an interest in land. And the RTB doesn't have jurisdiction where there's an interest in land. So you're probably in court on that. Yeah. That would be my expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the details about responsibility for maintenance are much less clear if there's not a written lease.
Because in this particular community, what happened was the owner of the land knew they were getting older and they knew that they were gonna pass away relatively soon. So the way to sort of give the land over to their children or whatever was to give them a land lease.
Okay.
So in this case, the TA wouldn't apply because they have an interest in.
I would say that that's probably true, yeah.
And then the estate just never got, like, the whole thing didn't get resolved.
Yeah, yeah, so I mean, that's a very complicated need to deal with the estates and then what this lease is.
They also don't have a landlord in
No.
that context.
They don't, which is why I was asking about who owns the buildings.
Well, technically, wouldn't the estate of the person who owned the land owns land be the landlord?
Um,
Because if you look at the title,
yeah.
it'll say the owner,
Mhm.
but you'll know that that person is not alive. So.
Right, it would say the estate
estate,
of, yeah. But, you know, I mean, you can own the building that's on land that you don't own.
Hmm,
That's your very typical like manufactured home park situation, right? Where you probably own the structure, you don't own the dirt underneath, if you have a lease for that. If you look at a lot of the big mansions on West Greenland, the people who own those houses own the structure, but they don't own the dirt under it. They have a lease for the dirt, but they own the structure. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're describing.
It's similar, but it's not on reserve, but yeah, it's.
Right,
yeah.
right, but I mean, it's a similar concept.
Yeah.
False Creek is almost all like that.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
That's an interesting.
Yes.
Okay. Mutual agreement to end tenancy. So we've talked about this one a bit. But one of the really important things to know about a mutual agreement to end tenancy is that if there are multiple tenants, one tenant can mutually agree to end the tenancy with the landlord without the knowledge, consent, agreement, whatever, of any of the other tenants. And if one tenant ends it, it ends for all. Terrible. In some situations, it's terrible, and in some situations, it is helpful. It is helpful in situations where there is family violence. And it's helpful in situations where, like, I've seen it in other situations where like a couple is separating and they're fighting over who gets to stay, who gets to go. The landlord can just go to one of them, look, I like you as a tenant, this whole situation sucks. Let's just mutually agree to end this thing and then I'll sign a new lease with you. So it does have its uses in that context. I mean, generally for like to the detriment of one or more people. But it can also be really helpful in a situation where like a handful of friends rent a house together. Now that they're living together, they realize this is a terrible situation and we're locked into a 2-year lease. We're 6 months in and I need out of this thing. That can be a way to have that happen without then being responsible for all the penalties that come along with it. Once the mutual agreement is entered into, it can't be undone. So the RTB, unless there's some kind of extraordinary duress or really unusual situation, if the parties have agreed to end the tenancy ends. It'll be enforced by the RTB. The RTB is not going to unwind it. And the RTB doesn't have the power to say, well, this tenant agreed to it, but that one doesn't. So the tenancy continues as long as at least one person, one of the tenants wanted to end the tenancy is over. It can be over effective immediately too. So you don't have to give a bunch of notice on this. You know, if I had a landlord right now and I wanted to end my tenancy today, we could sign a document that says the tenancy is over today. So it gives ultimate flexibility to agree to end on a certain date without notice. Yeah, and a landlord's not obliged to re-rent to a tenant who wanted to stay if one tenant has. So this is just kind of a preview for a lot of what we're going to be talking about on Thursday. So there are 5 sort of main types of evictions. One is a 10-day notice for unpaid rent or utilities. The next is 1 month notice for cause, a 2-month notice for landlord's use, 4-month notice for renovations, which is the renoviction eviction, and then where there's an emergency situation. So we're going to talk more about those 5, but those are the main types of evictions. So just a couple of things about the end of tenancy, and then we'll be done for the day. If there are other questions, we'll pop into them. So we talked about deposits at the beginning of the tenancy, at the end of the tenancy. Within 15 days of the tenancy ending, or when the tenant gives a forwarding address, whichever comes later, a landlord's required to either return the deposit or make an application to withhold it. Now, a tenant can agree to waive part or all of their deposit to pay for damage or excess cleaning at the end of the tenancy. They have to do that in writing. So if they agree to waive some or all of the deposit, it's done in writing. If they haven't made that agreement, 15 days from either the end of the tenancy or the tenant giving a forwarding address must be returned or an application. If a tenant doesn't give a forwarding address to the landlord doesn't have to return the deposit. It's not on the landlord to go track down the tenant if the tenant has left. But as soon as the tenant says, here's my forwarding address, that's when the obligation comes. If a landlord doesn't return the deposit or make an application to keep it, within 15 days after the later of the tenancy ending or getting a forwarding address, the tenant's entitled automatically to double the return of their deposit. So if they paid, with a pet and a damage deposit, $1,000, they move out and that day give a forwarding address to the landlord. 15 days go by, no damage deposit. On day 16, they can make an application and they'll be entitled to $2,000. Yes.
Do you get interest? Yes. Yeah.
So that was the next thing I was going to say. So the interest on deposits is set out by statute. There's actually an interest calculator that they finally created on the RTB's website, which is great. So what you can do is punch in the amount of the deposit, the day it was paid, the day it's being paid back, and it'll tell you to the penny exactly how much it's supposed to come. So for years, with interest rates being so low, the interest rate on deposits was 0. It's now increased with all of the interest rate increases. I'm not sure exactly what it is right now. I think it's 3 something. So it's not quite the Bank of Canada rate, but it's set out by statute. It doesn't usually end up being a lot of money in interest, but every little bit. So the landlord's not required to hold it in some kind of interest-bearing account or anything like that, but they do have to pay back the interest according to the. So at the end of tenancy condition inspection, landlord and tenant must complete a condition inspection. Now, if they didn't do one at the beginning of the tenancy, the utility of doing one at the end of the tenancy is a little bit less, but if a tenant refuses to participate in a condition inspection, they might forfeit their right to get their deposit back. So it is pretty important. If a landlord doesn't conduct the inspection, they might waive their right to charge against a deposit that they're holding for any damage. But one thing that's important to note is that failure to do inspections properly doesn't necessarily mean a landlord can't claim for damage if the damage is easily provable. So the lady who decided to decorate by carving in the wall, that was very easily provable. So even if there hadn't been a condition inspection report, presumably the tenancy didn't start with that carved in the wall. And so you can reasonably infer that that was done by the tenant during the tenancy. And so it's going to be something that would be conclusive. Tenant upgrade. Same with the spray paint. I've had a few other really fascinating
Addition.
interesting additions and interesting subtraction. And all of the rungs out of a banister, all the wood pieces contained. Yeah, I've seen some fascinating ones. So, so those sorts of things are still likely going to be provable. Also, excess cleaning, regardless of what a condition, whether a condition inspection report was done, if the place is left in an absolutely filthy state, that's going to be provable. And all that's going to be required is sort of photos or video evidence to show the state the place is in, and it's going to be compensable. So the condition inspections are important to participate in, if only so everybody knows what might be claimed. It gives the tenant the opportunity to write in the things they don't agree with, but there could still be a claim, even if the inspection isn't done properly. So damage versus wear and tear is one thing that gets argued about a lot. Reasonable wear and tear is not something that a landlord can claim for. And that's going to be things like small scuff marks, maybe little tiny nail holes from picture frames, you know, like a scratch along a baseboard, maybe a little bit of wear on a carpet if the tenancy's gone for quite a long time. These are sort of ordinary things that might happen just from day-to-day living. It's not going to be things like big gouges out of the walls, or holes, missing light fixtures, like fan blades missing, thinking of all of the examples that I've seen recently. You know, so ordinary things, like sometimes things break, you know, I've heard about like a mirror fell off a bathroom vanity and broke. That might be reasonable wear and tear. But things that are actually broken or that wouldn't just happen from sort of normal day-to-day life, living normally in a unit, like big stains, saw blue paint on a carpet once, that's not reasonable wear and tear. So it is one of the things that gets argued about. It's one of the things I see get claimed quite often at the RTB. It's one of those times when policy guideline 40 comes. So just a note about that. What we get to talk about. So more about evictions. We're going to talk about the actual dispute resolution process. So how the applications get made, how the hearings happen, what the evidence is that should go in. I have some tips and tricks for best practices for evidence packages, how to put them together, how to present what you're trying to present at the hearings. We're going to talk a little bit about appeals, what the options are, what they look like. We're not going to get into a huge amount of detail because that would take me another entire day to talk about judicial reviews, but we're going to do kind of an overview of what that process looks like. We've talked a bit about human rights considerations already, but we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the specific elements that apply to housing specifically and to tenancy. And then there'll be a few more things, I'm sure, and some more questions. And if anybody has specific things that they were wanting to discuss or ask about, I'm hoping that we'll allow us to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's honestly to find like mid-afternoon, you know, lull, but I hope, yeah, but I hope, I know that I threw a lot of information at you guys. That has been helpful.
Yeah, this would actually be a good moment because we are eventually, and the reason Leanne and Tristan is here is we're gonna be turning these two workshops into an online module for new staff to take if they want to learn more about advocacy and tenancy training, that sort of thing. And if either Allison or Sim are interested in learning about what we do, that'll be available for them. It'll be part of the inward facing part of this essentially MNBC training platform that we're creating. So while we were doing this, was there anything that you guys can think of that would help in converting this information that we're doing into something that we can engage with on a computer? So imagine Ashley's not here. You know, how do we get through all of this and still be able to retain that information and have it still be something that is easily digestible? I feel like a lot of the benefit here was that we were able to have really good discussions and be able to bounce questions off you as we kind of click on that. But I feel like reading through modules, it'll be more like we see something that's like, okay, maybe how do we look this up, or how do we ask that question for ourselves?
So it was recorded, right? Like the
Yeah.
conversation was recorded, right? So if it's possible to take like the questions that we asked and like maybe create scenarios out of it that would pop up throughout the stuff that's posted, like what we asked and then how Ashley answered. Like the way they have those kind of like bubbles when you're like, no, and then some of those kind of things have like quizzes later, but obviously you don't need to quiz people on the all like subsection D of this slide like 3 hours ago, you know, what's about this. We're obviously not gonna include that, but like, you know, like the different things, like say that like Adrian asked, and like Ken asked, or like I asked about like where I live, like explain how I'm not a tenant tenant in the place that I live, that I'm like an occupant there, and that like if it was to go to like the RTV for a complaint, Haley would have to make that complaint if I found an issue with where I live. I can't do that.
So are those kind of
And
situations,
Haley is my sublandlord.
Kind of.
In a
She's
way.
your, I mean,
She's my landlord, and then the landlord's also my.
yeah.
are those kind of situations public? Is that published enough ever?
Yeah, I mean, there are decisions about some of these things. Now, they're not super easily searchable. They're just the RTB's decision database is infuriating.
But are they comprehensible to? Yeah, okay, can we like, you can like embed like this stuff into the, to a module though, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure, that's-
how long are you trying to make this workshop?
I don't know.
Cause that's gonna have to be, you're not gonna be able to explain things at all in depth if we wanted to do a 3-hour thing.
No, I mean, the idea is that we have something that we can go back to as staffs to like get a primer
Yeah,
on the information, and there's also gonna be an outward facing piece of it where citizens are gonna be able to log on and basically be like, I just got a 10-day notice, what do I do?
Yeah.
So we're hoping to take a lot of the stuff that we're learning to advocate about and have it be like a FAQ or kind of a quick like best practices piece for the citizens. But for ourselves, we wanna find a way to convert what we're learning here in this workshop into a module that we can kind of have forever. But then, do we need to build it out? Is there additional modules that we need to make, or is there additional information that needs to be added? And it sounds like some of these conversations are ones where we developed a lot of it through that conversation. It wasn't necessarily just inherent in the slides, so we
Yeah.
might like the conversation around occupant tenant. Right, maybe that has to be its own slide within the module to really hammer home the point that there's a difference here. Or like you said, the tiers of landlord and that cascading idea of if you sublet, then you become the landlord. If it's a roommate, then chances are you're the one that's attached to it or otherwise.
Yeah.
Or maybe even some images.
Yeah, for sure.
Conceptualizing the tenant landlord arrangement when you've got roommates, occupants, et cetera, it might make sense in a graphic. Which- Oh, go ahead.
I felt it was really helpful when you were using your past experiences, like a short, like examples of that, making it more personable. I feel like could be easier to digest if you're just doing it online.
Maybe that's something that could be like a pop-up on, as you're going through the module, is as the conversations come up, it's an example pops up. Or some, maybe if we're going back into the conversations we're having, we use some of the ones that were anecdotal from your experience.
For sure.
Sorry, just the way that I was thinking of the module might work also is, I'm assuming it's video recorded.
Well,
What you guys can do, or like if it was a presentation, I was thinking of some things like Prezi, or even just having a presentation where you have something quick video recorded that's a condensed version of what you want on that slide. And then you have it linked to where it's like a read more. So you have a condensed version, it leads to a PDF, which kind of gives you a more detailed idea of what you're talking about. And the last stage is like frequently asked questions. That's usually you have it for anything. So that's what Liz was mentioning. Any frequently asked questions about that topic goes under that slide. So that's still one slide with subtopics underneath. So you're able to get all of that in there. But if somebody's doing training at work, they can just go through the quick video or like the quick main points and then be able to read more after. Cause like when we did training here, we were given the MNBC book. It's like, hey, read this on your own time or read this when you get the chance to. It'd be the same thing, the read more option that would link to the PDF with scenarios, etc. But like you can have like video or slideshow, point form, whatever you choose to have in that main slide, that kind of gives a condensed version of what's happening. I was thinking of that formatting, but that's obviously, I don't really know how you guys are like formatting all that. That's just what I do for school.
Well, it's the design in progress, so.
it is. I mean, we're trying to make the citizen side as palatable as possible. So like, videos, and quick cuts, more stuff like that, more images. I assume with you guys, you know, by paying you to be here, it's enough incentive to do the workshops. But we do still want it to be like understood and people not to just click through it.
Yeah.
So. We'll see. I feel like we certainly have the foundation here, and then the second session is probably gonna be a little bit more of that practical stuff when it comes to,
Yeah.
you know, how do we advocate for someone going through that arbitration process, and how do we prepare them for the hearing and evidence and
Yeah.
and whatnot. So having that as a primer that like maybe a tool that's an addition where it's just you can go back really easily to what do I need for the arbitration? And we can create a checklist out of it or something else, so.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I'm thinking a few tools like that would be great. And I think when I did gloss over a bunch of the stuff in the later slides because we had sort of already talked about it. So I think if you like go have a look through, you might see like there is a whole slide on occupants and on roommates and stuff that captures a lot of what we were talking about. Starting spot.
Question, if we're going to be advocating on behalf of our citizens in these issues, are there any liability concerns because we're getting involved in a dispute potentially between a landlord and a tenant?
So I mean, advocates are permitted at the RTB. So, you know, it's not a situation where in order to be there in support of someone, you're required to be a lawyer, you're not. You're there in support. You'd presumably be doing it entirely with the consent of the person that you're there on behalf of. In terms of liability, I mean, you're taking the information they're giving you, and you're presenting it in a way that's hopefully helpful to an arbitrator. So you're not, you know, in terms of liability, I'm not sure how you'd, like, I don't see a lot of problems there unless there's some negligence in the way that you're doing the advocacy, which, you know, I'm anticipating that there would not be because you're all gonna pay attention on Thursday and look back at the slides and checklists.
Is there any way that jump could be made by us like being attached to an arbitration? It goes in the favor of the landlord, and then the landlord isn't able to get the money out of the client or otherwise. Is there any way that it makes that jump?
No, you're the agent. It would be like if a client of mine who's a tenant is on the hook for a bunch of money, they can come after me. You know, just because I'm the advocate doesn't make me responsible. Just because you're the advocate doesn't make you responsible. The only potential responsibility there could ever be, I think, is if the citizen that you're representing felt like you had done a negligent job and they had a complaint in that way, which can happen in just about any scenario. If somebody wants to make a complaint, they'll find a way to complain. But it would have to go pretty far beyond. One of the things that I think we should probably talk about is just making sure you have some kind of like limit of liability, like a waiver that they're signing saying, you know, we are not lawyers. We're not giving you legal advice. We're giving you advocacy support. We're helping you present your case to the best of our abilities. You know, something along those lines.
But on Thursday, we'll be thinking about that, not just from the perspective of advocates, but also as like landlords. Sure as well, so.
Well, the reason why I brought it up was, and it wasn't specific to, it was specific to our home renovation program. But a contractor couldn't get their money from one of our citizens. So they decided to come after us.
Right.
Because that person is a citizen of MNBC or.
So that would be like suing the provincial government if I didn't pay one of my bills.
Oh, I agree,
mean,
but the lawyer for the contract was.
A lawyer brought that claim?
We provide a grant
Yeah,
to citizens so that they can do renovations on their
Sure.
home.
Yeah.
And a bit of the process comes through us and that they send us the quotes so that we agree to it and otherwise.
Oh, I see, okay.
But the money is a direct deposit to the citizen and then the citizen pays it to the contractor.
Right, okay, so, I mean, you just need to look at the contract, like, who the contractual relationship is between, right? The contractual relationship is presumably between the citizen and the contractor. Hopefully.
Yes, but the issue that we have is that they assume that Métis situation is the same as First Nations. So they assume that, you know, if the citizen doesn't pay, the band will pay, the Indian band will. And that was the same sort of logic that the lawyer was using as this person's a citizen of MNBC, therefore MNBC is responsible for all their debts.
Cool, I think that person needs to educate themselves. Like,
I can't say too much more, but that's kind of the general gist of it.
yeah,
It should have been an open and shut case, but because many of the parties involved were not properly educated on the matters, it still got brought to an arbitrator to deal with.
well, yeah,
And I was thinking that the same sort of thing could happen with this. Oh, my tenant is an MNBC citizen, therefore MNBC is ultimately responsible for any of the actions that they do.
yeah, and arbitrators never gonna make that call. That-
Okay.
Yeah, I think the analogy that I used of
Yeah.
the provincial government is all you would need to say to them, they'd be like, oh, right, okay, now I understand.
Okay.
I wouldn't be too concerned. Thoughts,
Okay.
questions, concerns? Anybody would like to? No?
Well, we get a little bit extra time to clear through our inboxes and.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet, we'll see you guys,
Thursday.
see you guys on Thursday.
Thanks.
Here, I just worried that it is. And I think that we're.
No, it's good.
Yes.
Yeah, I was even with all of the conversation with, so.